2,800 years ago, a blind poet known as Homer produced an epic that would map the limits of human endurance. His tale begins in the aftermath of the Trojan War. The Greek forces had finally breached the unyielding walls of Troy, relying on the cunning of one man, Odysseus. Having orchestrated the infamous Trojan horse, he had secured his reputation as the sharpest tactical mind in the ancient world. With his mission complete, the victorious king set his sights on his homeland of Ithaca. He departed the ruined shores with a massive, heavily armed fleet of ships, loaded with the spoils of war. This should have been a straightforward victory lap. Instead, the short voyage home spiraled into a grueling 10-year test of survival. The trouble started almost immediately. Stopping for supplies on the shores of Ismara, Odysseus and his crew found themselves violently driven back to their ships by a local tribe. Fleeing south, a massive storm blew them entirely off their charted course. They washed up among the lotus eaters, facing a threat that required no weapons at all. The locals offered the crew their island's native fruit, a powerful narcotic that erased the men's memories and stripped them of their desire to ever return home. Odysseus managed to drag his drugged men back to the ships, realizing a chilling truth. The open Mediterranean was a chaotic void, filled with invisible psychological hazards. A decade of traditional warfare had left them completely unprepared for what was out there. Searching for food on the next island, a small scouting party soon found themselves trapped inside a cave with a giant, cannibalistic cyclops named Polyphemus. Realizing brute force was useless, Odysseus used his intellect. He got the giant drunk, blinded him with a sharpened wooden stake, and loudly declared his own name was Nobody. When the other Cyclopes rushed to help, Polyphemus yelled that nobody was attacking him, leaving the Greeks free to escape hidden under the bellies of the giant's sheep. Safe on the water, Odysseus made a fatal error. Overcome by the thrill of outsmarting the monster, his ego took control. He shouted back to the shore, revealing his true name and his status as the famous hero of Troy. That single boast gave Polyphemus exactly what he needed. The blinded Cyclopes prayed to his father, Poseidon, the god of the sea. In retaliation, Poseidon cursed the Greek king to wander the oceans for a decade and watch his entire crew perish. The hero's greatest weapon, his brilliant mind, had secured their escape, but his total lack of humility had sealed their doom. This animated map tracks the steep cost of that curse. After receiving a magic bag containing the power of the winds, Odysseus navigated his fleet so close to Ithaca that they could see the shore. But his exhausted crew, convinced the bag was filled with hoarded gold, ripped it open while he slept. The escaping gales pushed them violently back into the open ocean. Blown hopelessly off course, they sought harbor among the Laestrygonians, a tribe of giant cannibals who pelted the fleet with boulders from the cliffs. Ship after ship sank into the harbor, leaving Odysseus with a single surviving vessel. The remaining men then washed up on the island of the witch Circe, who offered them a feast laced with a magical potion. When the crew awoke, they found their bodies twisted into the shapes of pigs. Odysseus forced Circe to reverse the spell, but the pattern was undeniable. Between the magical horrors of the sea and the fatal greed of his own men, the expedition was bleeding out. Before leaving her island, Circe advised a journey to the underworld. There, a blind prophet gave Odysseus one strict condition for his survival. When they reached the island of the sun god Helios, they must not harm his sacred cattle. Navigating back to the living world, the lone ship had to pass the sirens. Knowing their song lured sailors to their deaths, Odysseus plugged his men's ears with beeswax. He ordered them to tie him tightly to the ship's mast, allowing him to absorb the psychological torture of the bewitching song without being able to steer the ship into the rocks. Immediately after, they faced a literal dead end, a narrow strait guarded by Charybdis, a massive whirlpool, and Scylla, a six-headed beast. Odysseus made a grim tactical choice, steering towards Scylla and sacrificing 6 of his men to the monster to keep the ship intact. Their survival was short-lived. Stranded by a month-long storm on the island of Thrinacia, the starving crew waited for Odysseus to fall asleep and butchered the sun god's forbidden cattle. Furious, Zeus struck the ship with a massive thunderbolt once they set sail, drowning every man on board. The commander who had proudly left Troy with a towering armada was reduced to clinging to a piece of driftwood. He washed ashore on the island of the goddess Calypso, where he was held captive as the sole survivor for 7 agonizing years. High on Mount Olympus, the goddess Athena finally convinced Zeus to intervene and order Calypso to release her captive. Enduring one last shipwreck, Odysseus eventually set foot on the shores of Ithaca. He had been gone for 20 years. In his absence, his palace had been overrun by over 100 aggressive suitors, draining his estate's resources and pressuring his faithful wife, Penelope, to choose a new husband. Warned of the danger by Athena, Odysseus suppressed the ego that had nearly destroyed him at the Cyclops' cave. He allowed the goddess to magically transform him into a frail, aging beggar so he could walk undetected through his own front door. Announcing his return as a king would only get him killed by the mob in his dining hall. To reclaim his family, he had to operate with the calculated patience of an infiltrator. Penelope, having stalled the suitors for years, issued an impossible final challenge. She declared she would marry the man who could string her husband's notoriously rigid hunting bow and shoot an arrow cleanly through a row of 12 axe heads. Every young nobleman in the room tried and failed to even bend the wood. Amidst howling laughter, the old beggar asked for a turn. The room fell silent as he easily pulled the string taut and sent an arrow sailing flawlessly through all 12 axes. With the axes cleared, he turned the weapon on the crowd. Supported by his son Telemachus, who had locked away the suitors' weapons in advance, Odysseus systematically purged the men who had occupied his home. When Penelope finally embraced her husband, the 20-year trial concluded. Homer's epic has survived millennia because it shows that brute strength is never enough. True survival demands an agile mind, the capacity to weather total isolation, and an unyielding commitment to finding the way home.